It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Matt Smith, Director of Commodity Research with Clipper Data. Mr. Smith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, good morning, everybody. What we're going to do is going to rip through 17 things to watch out for in 2017, and then I'm going to pass over to the mighty Jeffrey Levine, who's going to cover some regulatory issues. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, first up, number one is natural gas storage. So looking at this chart, you can see we actually reached a record of 4 TCF at the end of last fall. But what has happened since then is we've basically fallen back into the 5-year range here. And that's important because natural gas storage is a key driver of natural gas prices. And so as long as we remain around the 5-year average, which we are, then we should see prices relatively in check. That said, 2 things to take away from this winter. One is that Punxsutawney Phil is useless. He is a hoax. He is a phony. He generally sees his shadow more often than he does not, and he is useless basically at predicting the winter, as we have seen. What is much better is the woolly worm. This is my fine photography. These were taken last fall. I go out every fall and take pictures of the woolly worm. If there is more brown on the woolly worm, that means it is going to be a milder winter. If there is more black, it means that it is going to be harsher. So as you can see, the evidence speaks for itself here. Woolly worm good, Punxsutawney Phil bad. On to number 2. All right, inventories. So from a US perspective, natural gas storage is pretty darn strong. From an oil perspective and a petroleum products perspective, it's even stronger. Just yesterday, we have reached a record high for gasoline stocks. We have got 259 million barrels of gasoline in inventories just here in the US. Not only that, we have also just reached a record just yesterday for crude oil inventories as well that have reached 518 million barrels. And so natural gas strong, crude oil strong, product strong. One word to describe the US, well supplied, with a hyphen in there to make sure it is just one word. Moving on, number 3, right, capacity additions. As you can see from the bar chart here, on the left-hand side, in equal measure, we have seen capacity additions on a utility scale basis from natural gas, from solar, and from wind as well. These have all been offsetting a lump of coal down here. If we zoom in into the renewable piece of this, you can see over the last few years that we have been seeing renewable utility scale capacity additions increasing their share of total capacity additions. And as we saw on the last slide, we've seen about 15 gigawatts of renewable capacity additions last year, and the vast majority, well, 2/3 of these have come through in the final quarter. So in the perspective of 2017, this trend should continue, and we will see capacity additions coming through from the likes of solar and wind apace. Moving on to LNG Dynamics, number 4. So this is a chart going back to 2014, and LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. Essentially what you do is you freeze it to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, and it then becomes a liquid, and it is 600 times more dense as a liquid than it is as a gas. It therefore makes it conducive for freezing it, popping it onto a tanker, and sending it across to the other side of the world. And that is what has really happened. Asia accounts for 75% of the global market for LNG. And so back in 2014, when US prices were around $2 an MMBTU, there were 16 in Asia, and so everyone started building out this liquefaction to be able to send this LNG across to Asia and collect in this money. However, what we've seen is prices absolutely tank down to $4 an MMBTU, and suddenly we're awash with LNG. That said, they've had a relatively cold winter in Asia. It's been even worse in Europe. The Danube, from the famous song, the Blue Danube, has frozen over. You have Bulgaria, which is on the Black Sea. They also saw their coast freeze for the first time in 60-odd years. And so they've really had these inclement conditions, and they have surpassed Asian prices. So as you see here, we've seen this increase, and this has been because of oil indexed pricing. LNG is linked to oil pricing, so as the oil price has rebounded, we've seen the same with that LNG price. That said, it's going to stay relatively in check, because we can see here that each year we're getting more LNG liquefaction capacity, basically supply, outpacing demand. And so this is the trend, not 2015, not just 2016, not just this year, but for the rest of the decade as well. And so we really are going to just see oversupply from the LNG side of things. Right, guys, this is the interactive piece. We're going to pull up a poll here to see how smart you are. I have to admit that I am the only person that gets to see the results of this poll right now. So your question is coming up now. California is first, Arizona is second. Which state is third in the nation for using solar energy? Is it 1, Nevada? Is it 2, Colorado? Or is it 3, North Carolina? And I can see the results coming in, and they are pretty surprising. Oh my gosh. All right, you will find the results out later. Let's move on. We'll get a couple more polls in as we go through this. Before we get to the mighty Jeffrey Levine, as I said. All right, number 5, U.S. is a net exporter of natural gas. This has only happened in the last couple of months. Essentially, we've historically been this importer of natural gas, but now we've seen record pipeline exports to Mexico. Not only that, but we kind of flipped the situation on its head, and we're now sending more gas to Canada. And as mentioned, LNG is coming through, and we're seeing LNG exports here in the U.S. coming through now, and we'll see another facility come online at the end of this year, another 4 that are in the construction process. And so all of this means that the U.S. is going to continue to be a net exporter, and that's really going to continue to ramp up in 2017. Number 6 means the half dozen, and we're on to the dirty half dozen. So the U.S. has the largest GDP in the world, but China produces actually the most emissions, the most populous place in the world as well, so I guess it shouldn't be too surprising. That said, China's power generation mix is predominantly coal, and this is a crazy stat, but China consumes 50%, 50, 1/2 of all the world's coal. Pretty crazy stuff. So this trend should continue this year. Unfortunately, although they're trying to get onto a better track in terms of renewables, as indeed the rest of the world is. That said, this is coming through from the U.S. Simply by shifting away from coal and towards natural gas. The U.S. here has seen its carbon dioxide emissions from the electric power generation side of things drop below those of transportation. And this really just highlights that pivot away from coal towards natural gas and towards renewables is a huge, huge measure, huge way to pivot away from such high emissions. Moving on, electric cars. 4 countries across the world account for 80% of all electric vehicles. And so you have China, the US, Norway, and the Netherlands. And what is probably the most awesome stat, I think, is that 23% of vehicles in Norway are electric vehicles, which is really very impressive, especially considering that the country gets its power generation essentially from hydro. And so a really remarkable stat there. So that given this kind of trend that we'll see this increasing, we're going to see them perhaps get up to 100% in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Here in the US, we've just passed 500,000 electric vehicles, and that trend will only continue through this year. That said, you can look at these long-term forecasts, and you have to take these with a pinch or 2 or 10 of salt. But although we've seen gasoline demand on a global basis increasing, we could well start to see it leveling off as we move into the next decade, simply because of the adoption of electric vehicles. That said, this does have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Moving on to number 8, and renewables. So even if the current administration do decide to revoke the Clean Power Plan, renewables will continue to gain. As you can see here, the yellow line, natural gas, continues to increase, but we see renewables coming through here. And so even if we don't see as much backing for renewables, they will still continue to get a bigger piece of the pie going forward. And this is simply because of costs. And so, as you can see here, the cost of from a solar farm, from all the different aspects of it, has really sort of dropped by a third since late last decade, and that will only continue to drop as well. And so it really is a case of economics as opposed to the need for subsidies going forward that are really going to drive that on. We saw it in the capacity additions previously, and you can see it here too, 45% increase from 2015 through 2018 in terms of US wind and solar generation. Really a focus onto that. But here in 2017, it really seems as if we're going to be on the ramp up from here on out. As you can draw attention to this line here, the renewables, you see it gradually increasing and then really starting to rip from here. You're starting to see it becoming apparent as we move through the next decade or two, when it really comes to be more of a force in the global market. Moving swiftly on to our next poll question. Here we go. Let's see if you guys can do better on this one. All right. It is coming up now. Which country consumes the most oil in the world? Is it 1, the US, 2, China, or 3, India? Okay, get your questions in, answers in, sorry. You got 7 seconds to go. 6, 5, 4. Hey, you've done a lot better on this one. Well done. Oh dear. Oh. Just eked the correct answer there. 53% of you can give yourselves a pat on the back. Alrighty, let's move on. Leaner and meaner. So we looked at renewables. In terms of fossil fuels and oil, here in the US, we've had like 2.5 years of much lower prices after the price crash from above $100 in mid-2014, and this has simply been because of these shale plays getting leaner and meaner, increasing efficiencies, figuring out how to operate at a much lower price. So what you have over here is Permian, Delaware, Permian Midland. That's the largest shale play in the US. Niobrara here, I don't know why, but it always makes me think of Australia. It should be like an Australia place in Australia, like, g'day mate, I'm from Niobrara, you want to have a beer? Apologies to any Australians out there. But yes, costs dropping across the board, top left down to bottom right. Let's swiftly move on. All right, 2 countries now coming up. Number 10 is India. Absolutely fascinating the evolution that we're seeing in terms of their economy. We have 8.8 billion people in the world. We have 1 billion people without access to electricity. A quarter of those are in India. And so the lighter shaded area here you can see means that a predominant amount of these people do not have access to electricity. So that's going to be a thing not only this year but coming through in the years to come. Not only are they going to get electrification, but their economy is going to grow and they're going to demand more energy from every single pocket that is out there. And so we see here that LNG is going to start to increase quite rapidly coming through from India. China's been the story for years, but it's really going to come through from them and also from oil. So as oil demand growth continues amazingly through 2040, we're likely to be consuming sort of 13 million barrels a day more at current projections. And the leader in terms of that oil demand growth is going to be from India. Moving on to Mexico, though. Mexico is another hugely interesting story in terms of their energy reforms that they are doing. You can see here in terms of natural gas, we talked about how the US has become this net exporter. You're really going to see those exports continuing. You see it here in the pipeline flows coming through. It's basically doubled in the last 2 years. And then we also see it coming through in terms of their LNG. And so they're increasing on all sides of things, really. But there really is this kind of symbiotic relationship between the US and Mexico. Mexico is one of the leading suppliers of oil to the US, heading into the US Gulf. And so if there was some sort of border adjustment tax placed on Mexico, it would have a huge impact on energy flows. Not only are they one of the key suppliers for the U.S. in terms of oil, but on the flip side of that, we are a key supplier of middle distillates, which is diesel, heating oil, and gasoline to Mexico. And so there is this very much intertwined relationship going on there. And so we're going to have to see how that develops with the current political environment. Moving on to number 12, retail gasoline prices. We are currently basically at $2.30 on the national average. We should see that sort of eke out a bit of an increase, all else being equal, over the next month. That is generally the seasonal trend. And then what happens is you really get refineries kicking in, going full tilt to make sure that the U.S. is well supplied during the summer months through summer driving season when there is peak demand. And then after that, what we should see is prices generally fade lower to finish at a low for the year in sort of November, December time. But all that said, we shouldn't see prices move too much higher from where they are here. And so maybe up to $2.40 on the national average, but nothing too crazy unless oil prices go nuts, which it doesn't seem they are going to. And that's because we're in this dilemma for OPEC. And so OPEC essentially has two choices. These are the cartel that control sort of 40% of the world's oil. And so either to try and boost prices, they can cut production. But if they do that, then it pushes the oil price higher, and then U.S. shale production increases, as we are seeing it happen. And then they lose their share and they lose their revenues. But they really didn't have much of a choice, really, because if they didn't decide to cut production, then it would mean lower oil prices, because they put more into the market, and then their revenues would decline anyway. So they're really in a lose-lose situation here. And from that perspective, the U.S. is really in a very good position, because we should see natural gas and oil production increasing in response to those higher prices. Moving on, right, number 14. The impact of low oil prices really is best typified in this chart and is yet to be felt by us. What has happened because of the low oil price environment, you've essentially had the super majors, the likes of BP, Chevron, Total, Shell, that have cut back their spending to hunker down and try and save costs and make it through, defend their dividends, and wait for oil prices to rise. Oil prices are rising now. They are starting to invest back into spending and exploration, which we are seeing. That is a key theme of 2017. But that said, 2016 we saw the lowest oil discoveries since 1947, the year of my good mother's birth, because simply they just cut back so much on spending. Okay, this is awesome. The way to cut energy consumption is really being driven by energy efficiencies. And we're seeing this across a number of different aspects of the economy, and we do this through regulations. And so as you can see here, lighting regulations account for sort of 70%, something like that, 65% of total consumption of lighting. Same for light vehicles. We have fuel standards in place. By putting mandatory standards and regulations in place, that is the low-hanging fruit, the best way to cut back on energy consumption. And we see this across the board, from our appliances to our cars to lighting to everything. And these will only increase, and that will only increase our efficiency going forward. All right, so we've just got a couple more things to do before I pass you off to Jeffrey. So let's just take a quick look at production. As I mentioned, 2017 is going to be the year of returning spending and exploration in the U.S. and abroad as well. And so after 10 years here of increasing production in the U.S., 2016 was the first year where we saw natural gas production actually pull back. However, we are going to see it return to form this year, just as we are seeing that coming through from oil production as well. Now, this is based on our own forecasts here. U.S. oil production is around 9 million barrels a day, just less than half of our total consumption. And we believe that if we see an oil price up in the 60s, then we'll see another 600,000 barrels a day added to U.S. production. We believe that if we hover around where prices are now, we'll still see it up over 9.25, something like that. But it would really take a price below $40 for us to really start to see US production dropping off. So key takeaway is that we're likely to see stronger production coming through, and because there's so much associated natural gas coming from oil, that will mean that natural gas will increase too. Final poll questions. Hurrah, you say. All right, let's play. Okay, number 3. Here we go. Boom, 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 boom. Which region has the highest share of renewables in its power generation mix? Number 1, Asia. Number 2, the US. Or number 3, Europe. Cast your votes now. This is quite good fun with these polls. I haven't done this before. Okay, you got 10 seconds left. Oh, we're seeing the best results so far coming through here. Congratulations, 79.2% of yourselves can give yourself a pat on the back. 77.2. Oh, it's dropping. Quick, close it. Alrighties. Okay, so finally, everything comes back to prices, really, doesn't it? And if you've seen me present before, I always talk about this slide as I say tomato and you say tomato, because you have these inverse relationships across commodities. And so these are just 2 ways to highlight it with natural gas and with oil. So with oil, first of all, you have it with the US dollar. So that is the dark blue line here. Sorry, the light blue, and then the dark blue is the oil price. And so in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And that's what we are here in the US. We're seeing interest rates being increased, even though our economy not be going absolutely gangbusters or anything. We're doing a darn sight better than most of the rest of the world. Japan in negative interest rates, etc. And so one thing that is really going to provide headwinds to the US oil price is going to be the strength coming through in this US dollar, because as that increases, it puts downward pressure on oil. And so from that perspective, where we are with the oil market now seems to be relatively fairly priced in that $50 range, and that's why we're finding that we are so considerably range-bound. And then there is a similar relationship too for natural gas, where you have storage being such a key driver, which we talked about right at number 1 at the beginning of all of this. And what this just shows you is that the surplus to that 5-year average, the higher that is, the lower that natural gas price is. So now we just had the storage report today. We're like nearly 4% above the 5-year average there. And because of that, that's pushed down natural gas prices well below $3. And so really what's happening is, as long as we remain around that 5-year average, as it seems to be doing, given that here in the mighty Louisville, Kentucky, is going to be 70 degrees at the weekend or that. Warm conditions means less demand, means higher surplus for storage, means lower prices for natural gas. So with that, I will hand you over to the mighty Jeffrey Levine. He is the Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Energy Resources. Either that or he told me his title was Supreme Allied Commander, which I tend to like a little bit better. So with that, Jeffrey, I will pass the ball across to you. I'm just about to give you control.
Thank you very much, Matt. I thought that was a great presentation with a global perspective on energy resources. I saw that we got a few questions that came in that looked very provocative. When I'm done, we'll get to the Q&A session, and folks will be able to hear Matt's responses to at least some of them. Well, as Matt said, my name is Jeffrey Levine. I'm the Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs. We're going to narrow our focus a little bit after Matt's global perspective, which I appreciated very much. So I'm going to start with state initiatives, and for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the renewable portfolio standards that are changing. One state, at least within PJM, where I'm going to focus for today, zero emission carbon standard. Just a quick note on a sales and use tax change, and then a question around re-regulation. When we're done with state initiatives, I will try to speak to some complicated PJM-wide initiatives. I'll just tell you ahead of time, there's always a lot more detail behind these PJM market changes that I won't be able to get into. I am an available resource for you folks. So if you want to contact who you know at ENGIE, they can put you in touch with me, and we can always get into the details if we don't get into it today. All right, so let's start with Illinois, because I think Illinois, within PJM at least, is going through one of the more significant changes with regard to renewable portfolio standards. So we had a piece of legislation that was passed and signed by the governor, so it's now law at the end of 2016, and it did a few significant things. One, it took the renewable portfolio standard and increased it, I think, significantly, but if you look at other states, it's not by any means the greatest increase. So Illinois will now be looking to achieve 25% renewable power to cover the consumption of load by the year 2025, and it'll ramp up to that. The other significant change is that the obligation to comply is going to move away from retail competitive suppliers. In Illinois, we're called alternative retail electric suppliers, and it's going to be picked up by the Illinois Power Agency, which is a state agency, and they're going to enter into contracts that are really done on behalf of the two utilities. So you're seeing a shift from the RPS being a component of a competitive supplier's pricing and billing to it being a component that all ratepayers will pay through their distribution charges. There's just a small graph there that shows what the transition will be. Today, we're in business as usual. As you know, in PJM, the year is a June through May year. We call that the delivery year. So a lot of states try to adopt rules that also follow that June 1 to May 31st year. So today we're still in the delivery year of 16-17, and it's business as usual. We will be meeting our RPS obligations, and we'll be doing it on behalf of our shopping customers. But June 1 of 2017, our RPS obligation is cut in half. On June 1 of 2018, it's cut down to 25% of the load we serve. And on June 1st of 2019, it's removed completely. And at the same time that we are phasing out of the competitive supplier obligation for RPS, the state will be ramping up. So the Illinois Power Agency has some work to do. It will be doing this with the Illinois Commerce Commission, which is really the regulatory body that oversees utilities, tariffs, etc. So they're going to create multi-year power purchase agreements. They're probably going to look for anywhere between 10 and 15-year deals. And just to give you a sense of scope, they're going to be looking for millions of renewable energy credits from new wind and new photovoltaic, which is solar, and also the energy efficiency standards for the state will increase. Those will also be addressed through state utilities. The 2 points that I think are worth noting that complicate what Illinois is doing are as follows. One, the law changed how you define an eligible REC for complying with Illinois' RPS. And it raises a lot of questions because what they wanted to make sure was that they didn't have neighboring states that might be vertically integrated or might have utility rate subsidies, having renewable energy plants or facilities in those states kind of bid in and sell into Illinois when those renewable plants were already being subsidized by another state. So they came up with language in the law that I've quoted here that you can read. But this question that this raises is, what will this do to the banked RECs that areas currently have? Will they become ineligible or not? The state has not given us guidance on this yet, so before an Aries can determine that its RPS costs are going to go down as we transition away from having the obligation, it has to determine if its existing RECs are going to be devalued or not, because if it has to go out and buy new RECs that meet this new criteria, that might be more expensive. So the actual impact to Aries and their customers is unknown, and we're waiting for state guidance. We've sought it, but I don't think the state is prepared yet to answer these questions because this came out of the legislature, not out of the executive branch where the Illinois Commerce Commission is. The second point that's worth noting is whether we can continue to offer voluntary green products after June 1st, 2019. And I don't think anybody in the legislature's intention was to block 100% voluntary green products. But if you look at the language of the law, it literally says that after May 31st, 2019, the retail electric supplier has got to certify that it's not charging its customers for anything. They want to avoid double paying, and that makes sense. On May 31st, 2019, the RPS obligation will shift away from the ARIES to the utility distribution charge. And you don't want a customer paying for the same compliance for renewables twice. I get it. But with the wording here, what if a shopping customer wanted to do some kind of voluntary 100% green product and the retail supplier was offering it? Well, in that case, you actually have a retail supplier collecting money from a customer for a REC when it's not obligated to do so. And the law says that we have to certify that we don't do that. So I think something like this is also going to have to be worked out. Again, I can't imagine the intent was to limit the opportunity of consumers to opt for 100% green products. But again, it's something that's been raised and we'll have to work out. While we're on Illinois, I might as well go to the other big issue, which was really the primary driver behind the legislation that now is the new law. And that was that 2 large nuclear power plants were going to retire. And the state made a decision, and you could say it's for political reasons, economic development reasons, maybe jobs, whatever you want to assign to these decisions, that we didn't want to let these 2 large nuclear power plants go out of business. Maybe it was an idea for supporting carbon reductions, and nuclear power plants are zero carbon emitting resources. So the thrust behind the legislation was really to create a subsidy that the state would pay for going directly to these 2 nuclear power plants. It's going to be a 10-year deal. Again, it's going to be the state agency that's required to purchase them. Their code name is ZEC, the Zero Emission Carbon Credit, or just Zero. The cost of the ZEC will be flowing through the distribution charge of the bill. It'll be priced at $16.50 a megawatt hour. And then beginning in about 6 years, that price is going to increase by $1 a year. There's no avoiding this, whether you shop or not. You are going to pay this as a ratepayer in Illinois. They did put in a fail-safe mechanism to limit the potential cost impacts to consumers, but that would really mean that the revenue that these generators make from the PJM energy market and the PJM capacity market and the PJM ancillary services market, which they still can bid into, has to get above a certain amount, and then the state says, if you're making that much from the market, we don't need to give you basically a subsidy that we've called a zero emission credit. The interesting thing is with the federal change of administration and what you would expect to be the change at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington and at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, there does seem to be a shift in national policy towards implementing some kind of carbon emission reduction strategy. So I think Illinois was getting ahead of the federal government when we had the Obama administration. I don't think the Trump administration is going to play catch up in any significant way. So you might end up seeing more of these state-by-state plans that address large nuclear power plants more than just the renewables. And just for clarity, a ZEC, even though it should apply to renewable energy like wind and solar, etc., doesn't. It's only for the nukes. The renewables get, the RECs. So it may seem counterintuitive, but that is how the rules are written. So back to just standard RPS, because it does seem to be a theme state by state with increases. Here we have the Maryland Renewable Portfolio Standard, again increased 25% to a level of 25% RPS by 2020. That's a little bit, steeper than the Illinois number, which was 25% by 25. 2025. Tier 1 and solar requirements are going to move up. The alternative compliance payment will come down. The thinking there is more and more states, whether they be led by Democratic or Republican governors, tend to have growing concerns about the cost of renewable portfolio standards. So to the degree that the alternative compliance payment can act as a benchmark for where REC prices trade and settle, if you lower the alternative compliance payment, you generally put downward pressure on REC prices. So this is just an attempt to kind of contain costs on the consumer's compliance with renewable portfolio standards. What's interesting about this one, and I'll just share it as a political aside, both houses of the state legislature voted to override the veto that the governor signed. So the governor vetoed the increase, and then just in January of this year, there was a vote to override the veto. So the effective date of this RPS is March 3rd, which is a Friday of this year. And I think the supplier community was pretty adamant that whenever you increase the RPS at any state, you need to protect existing contracts because those retail contracts don't have prices that reflect the higher new RPS. They were based on the rules that were in place then. So they were successful here in Maryland. No contracts were executed. No contracts that are executed prior to the effective date of March 3rd will need to comply with the higher standards until they roll off. So you'll have two sets of compliance. You'll have your old contracts that are going by the older renewable portfolio standard in Maryland, and then anything that's prospective will include the appropriate compliance prices for the new. New Jersey. So New Jersey did not increase its renewable portfolio standard, but the reason I included this information here is because New Jersey every year introduces legislation to increase the renewable portfolio standard, primarily focused on solar. So legislation again passed both houses and was sent to the governor to increase the solar requirements in the state. The governor is expected to veto it. The governor has not vetoed it yet, and at some point if he takes no action, it's as if he vetoed it. But what's interesting here, and the reason I want to make you aware of this, is New Jersey is one of the two states that has an off-year election cycle. And this November there will be statewide elections, but most importantly for the governor. The existing lieutenant governor is going to run for the Republican candidate position, and there are a slew of Democrats who are lining up to run for the Democratic candidate position. There's a projected, I don't want to claim that I know the answer, but the Democrats projected to win. And I think what you can anticipate is future RPS increases because the new governor, who is likely to be a D, is not likely to veto legislation to increase the renewable portfolio standard. And what we can see ahead of time based on past experience is language that protects existing contracts is not likely to be included, because the same language that I showed you in Maryland has never successfully been amended to any of these efforts in New Jersey. There's just a different feeling about it. Maybe they want to have more of the RPS increase apply to more megawatts, so why exclude any contracts with megawatts flowing? So that's where my idea is on where New Jersey is going. Done with renewable portfolio standard now, I wanted to just talk about a sales and use tax. This has already happened, but you should know about it. I'm sure you already do, but if you don't, now it's officially out there. The sales and use tax in New Jersey is interesting because it has to be included in the price you present to customers. It cannot be a separate line item. Whereas in other states, you can present your price and then you can show on a separate line item taxes and other things. In New Jersey, you have to bake it in and show one price. So any changes to taxes really do increase, well, I shouldn't say increase, in this case decrease, but impact price presentation. So to help with the education, just so you know, the change went into effect January 1st of this year. The utilities have agreed to put in January bills a simple statement. I don't know if I have the quote exactly, but I did see early emails that it was going to be something like, this bill reflects a decrease in the New Jersey sales and use tax from 7 to 6.875%. Third-party suppliers are encouraged to do the same to avoid any confusion, but you do have to remember that it's not just going to be a tax line, it's going to be the entire price. So we got some guidance on how you present this information, because a lot of third-party suppliers, which is what retail suppliers are called in New Jersey, were questioning if there are 2 step-downs in the sales and use tax, and they happen over 2 years. As you can see, it steps down for calendar year 2017, and then it steps down again for 2018 and beyond. What do we do with multi-year deals that span from before the tax change or from the middle of one tax change to after the next tax change? Are we allowed to blend it and come up with a weighted average? The bottom line is no. New Jersey made it clear to suppliers, so I hope every third-party supplier is abiding by this, that we have to collect the tax from the customer at the rate set by law and in the same amount that we give back to the state. So each time the sales tax decreases, it did it once January 1st of this year, it'll do it another time January 1st of 2018. We need to actually lower our price and inform the customer of that price change, because it is a component of our stated price. It's not a separate line item. The other place where it affects us is on offers for indicative pricing to prospective customers, and when we advertise. We cannot use weighted average pricing for advertising or indicative pricing because, again, it would not be a true statement on what we're collecting. Re-regulation. Everyone likes to wonder about that. I think the only place where there's active discussion is Ohio. So the question is, will the Ohio utilities try to influence legislators to re-regulate the retail electricity market? I can tell you that there was a lot of effort last year, calendar year 2016, where the utilities tried to use the Public Utility Commission of Ohio as a re-regulation tool. They wanted to create distribution or wires charge subsidies for their affiliated generation. So they wanted to kind of not officially bring generation back into the utility holding company, but to use the utilities collection billing mechanism to give money to their affiliate, their generation affiliate. The state said no, kind of, because when the blatant question was, we're calling this a generator subsidy, would you let us collect money from every ratepayer to give to our affiliated company generators? The answer was no. But what they ended up doing was giving them a little bit less money and calling it something else, like a grid modernization rider. But in the end, what we really learned was that the Commission was under political pressure to support the balance sheet of local utilities. They did so. They didn't want those utilities to experience credit downgrades or anything that might affect their financing abilities. So they basically gave them money for their balance sheet. They called it a grid modernization rider. They didn't want to call it a generation subsidy rider. They could have just called it a balance sheet support rider, but it was political. So they got some money, and it's being collected from all ratepayers, and it's going to do nothing to enhance retail markets or modernize the grid. It was just for the balance sheet. So if that was 2016, I can tell you that there were many legislators then who were displeased with that whole process. They didn't like the utilities asking. They didn't like that the Commission was entertaining it. They saw that it was political because the governor of Ohio was at the time in the midst of a presidential campaign. So for those utilities to go back now to the legislature, which we're hearing they will do, and seeking more money because what they got wasn't enough, could fall flat. But the utilities are very powerful and influential in their backyard, so I would not count this out. I don't think it's a slam dunk, though, and obviously opposition would likely include the consumer advocate, groups of retail suppliers. I've even heard wholesale generators are opposed to the re-regulation because there's a lot of merchant generation in Ohio. Large customer groups, brokers naturally line up against this because it undermines the market. The last thing I'll mention is that there have been surveys to kind of figure out public opinion, and recent surveys by a group called the Alliance for Energy Choice indicated very little public support for taxpayer subsidies to the utilities. But we have to keep an eye on this, and we have to treat it with respect because it's a very big issue and a good market. Okay, so now we're done with state initiatives. I'd like to just move over to some PJM-wide initiatives. These are complicated. There's a lot of information on the slide. I'm going to try and keep it at a high level. But again, on a subject like this, if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards, we can discuss it in further detail. So basically, PJM's capacity market has what they call a base residual auction, the first big auction that happens 3 years ahead of time. So we're about to enter into the 2017-2018 delivery year. It begins June 1st of 2017. So 3 years ago, they had the base residual auction, May of 2014. Then regularly scheduled incremental auctions, there are 3 of them, are conducted to adjust for any changes to load forecast or generator outages. So a generator that might have bid to sell into that first auction might find that it's got an outage and it won't be able to deliver, so it needs to adjust supply and demand. And these little incremental auctions are usually low volume, low dollar, and they don't have a significant impact on the overall price of capacity, although they do get factored in. Well, last year, in the third incremental auction for the 2016-2017 delivery year, the one we're in right now, we had a very different experience. We had a lot of megawatts being sold, and it had a lot of impact on the unitized price of capacity. So we're afraid that the third incremental auction that's going to happen at the end of this month for the upcoming year might do the same, and here's why. Load forecasts for the upcoming delivery year, the 17-18 delivery year, have been decreasing. PJM, with that decreased load forecast, realizes it has over-procured what it needed by 10 gigawatts. That's 10,000 megawatts. And if you remember, PJM's capacity market had an adjustment about 1.5 years ago where they came up with some super reliable, super deliverable generator megawatt, and they got it approved by FERC, and it was called capacity performance. It was a response to the polar vortex and the outages that occurred. And it was of this more expensive, highly reliable, highly deliverable megawatts that they overprocured. So not only did they overprocure 10 gigawatts, they overprocured the expensive good stuff. So as you can see, a similar sale last year of only 5 gigawatts resulted in an increase of almost $5 a megawatt day to a consumer. Now, if you put that in megawatt hour pricing, that's only 20 cents, and that's for a 100% load factor customer. If a load factor for a typical customer is 60%, this would be more of a 33 cents per megawatt hour impact increase. So we don't know what's going to happen with the third incremental auction that's happening at the end of this month, but 5 gigawatts created this kind of impact. We don't know what's going to happen when 10 gigawatts are sold. There is some correlation with the price it sells at. So it's not just how many megawatts are sold, but at what price they sell. So there were concerns among the load community within the PJM stakeholder process that selling back 10 gigawatts at zero created no value for load. So they created a mechanism for this auction that set a floor price of approximately $11 and an upward sloping demand curve. So the more megawatts they sell back, the higher the price they'll get for the sellback. There are 2 significant impacts of all of this to you. Selling back megawatts in any incremental auction, but in the third incremental auction at a low price compared to the price of the BRA. And remember, the price of the BRA for this year, I think, was $120 a megawatt day. So that would put upward pressure on the unitized capacity price for consumers. And let me just take a second to tell you what I mean by unitized. And I'm going to use a lemonade stand example. It's a crude one, but I hope it helps. Imagine you have 2 glasses of lemonade being sold at a lemonade stand, and they sell for $50 each. So someone has spent $100 to get 2 glasses of lemonade. Now they decide they only need 1 glass. So they decide to sell lemonade back. And someone buys it for 10 bucks. And they sell it to them. So you had $100 spent for 2 glasses of lemonade originally, which would create a unitized price per glass of lemonade of 50 bucks, 100 divided by 2. But now you've reduced the overall cost you've spent to $90, so you could say system-wide, I'm only spending $90, not $100 for lemonade. But when you figure out the unitized cost of that remaining 1 glass of lemonade, it's 90 bucks. So the total system cost of capacity can come down from these kind of sellbacks, but the unitized cost of capacity can go up, like in the example I gave you. And that all depends on how many megawatts you sell back and at what price you sell them back. So not only does the amount and price, in fact, impact the unitized price of capacity, but the amount sold back also can impact what they call a zonal scaling factor. And all that means is that many zones of PJM demand different amounts of capacity because of their different constraints. Constraints on location of generator, constraints on transmission capabilities in and out of those zones. So they create a relationship between the different zones of PJM called the scaling factor on how they share the costs of the system's capacity. The amount of sellback will impact that scaling factor because the scaling factor is a relationship between what was forecast and what was actually purchased. If you change what was actually purchased, you change the numerator. And I don't want to get into the math, but the bottom line is if you're changing potentially with upward pressure on unitized price of capacity and you're potentially increasing zonal scaling factors, the only thing that can really save a customer from higher capacity prices is if it has coincidentally reduced its cap tag. But if it hasn't, there's a good chance that there's going to be exposure. The next PJM item, 5-minute settlement. Basically, generators are dispatched on 5-minute intervals. And FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, believed that it would be most efficient to pay them on the same intervals that they were dispatched on. Before this rule, they're paid on an hourly average, and yet they're dispatched every 5 minutes. Load, consumption, is also settled on an hourly average. Now, they're not going to change how load is settled. All the systems are set up behind every third-party supplier, behind PJM, behind the utilities, to provide hourly data on consumption from consumers. But now you're going to say PJM, which is going to be revenue neutral, is going to pay generators on 5-minute intervals, but they're going to collect from customers on an hourly average. This won't be implemented until next spring, but it will create regular imbalances in what PJM collects from consumers and pays to generators. And whenever there's an imbalance, either way, they have to do a market settlement. And they're going to have to come up with some market mechanism to do that. Not sure which market mechanism they'll use. Will they look to just create uplift? Will they look to adjust marginal loss allocations? Not sure. But just 2 examples illustrate this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but I just wanted you to see them. And you can look at them later. But the bottom line is, depending on how many megawatts, and by the way, this example, instead of showing 5-minute interval payment for generators, just to make it easy, I showed 30-minute interval payment. But the point is, if you change one half of the equation, who you're paying, the generator, to a different kind of time frame from what you're collecting, because you're going to collect on a 60-minute average 60-minute basis, but you're going to pay in the rule on a 5-minute. My example simplified it for a 30-minute. You will have different amounts that are collected and different amounts that are owed. And whenever there's that imbalance, it could be uplift or it could be a credit. But it's something that we're going to have to watch for and figure out how the market will adjust to it. For all I know, in the end, they're going to say the 2 ways of settling generators and consumers should be the same, so let's change all of our systems to settle consumers on a 5-minute period. Obviously, you would need a lot of meters to be deployed that can handle that. You would need a lot of software systems, communication, and back office billing to change. But I do think at some point there's going to be a displeasure with this imbalance that's going to be created when 5-minute settlement for paying generators is implemented. Two other quick things to wrap this up that are happening in PJM. I'm going to keep this at a high level. One of the PJM transmission charges that flow through to consumers is called the Transmission Enhancement Charge. Based on a decade-old lawsuit that is pending at FERC for settlement, they could reallocate almost $1 billion. I think it's higher than $800 million, but less than $900 million in transmission costs. And the general direction is going to be credits to the west and charges to the east. So it's not going to be insignificant, and it will go on for about 10 years. So if FERC approves the proposed settlement, then we will see billing mechanisms created, like I said, that for a 10-year period credit people in the western part of PJM and create new charges for people in the eastern part. The last quick thing is allocation of balancing congestion costs. So balancing congestion has to do with the inputs and outputs on a real-time basis in the system. How many withdrawals, how many injections there are, what kind of congestion is created on the grid by all of that. And typically, it's been a negative charge. And it's been housed in the FTR holder's house. So if you had financial transmission rights, you all of a sudden got the value of that FTR docked by the negative component that came through the balancing congestion. Well, an argument was made at FERC that that was unfair. FERC surprised the market just at the end of last year and said, we agree. There's no reason why a day-ahead financial transmission right should have anything to do with a real-time congestion component. So we're going to reallocate this to real-time load. So that's something that has to be implemented. But once it does, I think the significance is that retail suppliers will see in their invoice from PJM a new line item that says balancing congestion. It's likely to be negative, meaning they're going to owe PJM money, and they're going to have to figure out a way to work with their customers or incorporate those costs into their pricing. So that was a kind of a whirlwind on state initiatives and some significant PJM-wide issues, but that is all that I have for today. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt, or if I answer some of the questions too, that'll be great, and I really appreciate your time.
Nicely done, Jeffrey. Okay, I believe that we are out of time, and so I think we're going to have to hand back to the moderator. But everyone that has answered questions, we will answer directly to you online if we haven't already.
Thank you. As a reminder, any questions submitted during the event will be answered offline after the event. A survey will be appearing on your screen momentarily. Please take a moment to complete it.